He did.
So.
First thing I have to do is take some notes, then. How have you been?
I've been fine.
Good evening. My name is Yamil Khoury. I am the research coordinator for Latin America and the Caribbean at the Harvard Institute for International Development, and I also teach a course here at the Kennedy School on issues of health policy in developing countries. I've formerly been the director of the National Center for Scientific Research in Cuba, director of AIDS research at the Pan American Health Organization, and co-chairman of the Harvard Amsterdam AIDS Conference. But I'm not here only in those capacities, but the fact of the matter is that our principal guest speaker, Dr. Terry, and I were medical students together at the University of Havana, and that was many years ago. I've known Dr. Terry for many years, and as I mentioned, we studied medicine together. We were both part of the Cuban Revolution. Then our paths diverted, and we're here together again, sharing the same panel, as we've also shared a dedication during these years to the improvement of public health and our love for Cuba. It is therefore particularly interesting for me to be able to introduce him and to host him tonight. And we're very fortunate that Dr. Terry is here. Some of you may know that last year he was supposed to be with us, but he was denied a visa, and we worked very hard to help him get here. He was supposed to be accompanied by the Minister of Health at the APHA meeting in Washington. The minister's visa was disallowed by the US government, but Dr. Terry was allowed to visit us. And probably, if we waited till next year, no doubt this would be easier to arrange. So I'd like to begin by giving you more background about our three guest speakers and say a word about AIDS policy in Cuba before opening the discussion. I'll ask Dr. Terry to speak first, then Larry Gostin and Mark to comment. We'll give Dr. Terry a chance to respond to those comments, and then we'll throw it open to questions and comments. Dr. Terry is the Vice Minister of Health of Cuba and is responsible for AIDS policy as the director of the National Program of the Ministry of Health Against AIDS, and he is the architect of the policies by which this program has achieved international notoriety. These include the policies in respect to the Cuban soldiers in Africa, especially in Angola, and the screening of the entire Cuban population for HIV, as well as the establishment of sanatoriums where all HIV-positive individuals are kept. Larry Gostin is our leading legal scholar and commentator in the US about AIDS policy matters. He has been a major figure in working with WHO in reviewing AIDS legislation comparatively and internationally, has written extensively on a wide variety of human rights questions, not only in regards to AIDS, but with regard to a variety of other policy areas. He is the president of the American Society for Medicine, Law, and Ethics. Mark Roberts, everyone knows him, is on the faculty of the School of Public Health and the Kennedy School. He's the director of the State and Local Government Executive Program at the Kennedy School, teaches an introductory course on the ethics of public health policy at the School of Public Health, and was one of the key organizers of the conference held here 2 years ago on AIDS policy, where policymakers from around the country convened at the Kennedy School. As context for Dr. Terry's remarks, so it wasn't clear to me that everybody in the audience would know what Cuba's AIDS policy have been, I would like to take a minute to highlight the salient features of these policies. He will, in detail, describe the program, but those that have been subject to most intense discussion are massive population testing and sanatoriums established in each province in which all HIV positives are admitted and kept. This policy obviously has been very controversial in the world, represents a different approach to AIDS than other nations have taken. Because it is so interesting, we hope to have a full and frank discussion. This is a subject on which, quite legitimately, opinions are extremely strong. Views are very heated. The stakes here are undeniably extremely substantial. And while we recognize the passion, the commitment and concern that many people bring to the subject, our purpose here is to have as full and as frank and as serious and intellectual conversation as we can about this subject. And as we get into the question period, I'm going to ask that all of you proceed in the same spirit. So now, I would like to introduce Dr. Terry.
Thank you, Dr. Jamil Coury. Ladies and gentlemen, I have to thank Dr. Jamil Coury and you forgive me the possibility to speak about our AIDS program and strategy in Cuba. You have to forgive my bad English. I was studying 9 years in my country, but I cannot practice because the commercial embargo, as you know. But I'll try to do the best in my conversation with you. I'll try to give you a brief overview about our program and our strategy. I have to say you that in 1983, August, we attended the first PAHO workshop here in Washington. When we come back, the Ministry of Public Health creates a national committee for prevention and facing of AIDS composed by general practitioners, dermatologists, epidemiology, and hematology. At that time, we took 2 decisions. First, prohibition of hemoderivated importation from Western Europe and United States. 2, setting up of epidemiological surveillance system because of Kaposi sarcoma and repeated pneumonias, weekly hospital report. We continued our surveillance system since August 1983 to January in 1986, when we can buy the equipment and technology to test people and to know the seropositive situation. We developed our AIDS control program in these basic aspects. First, mass screening. 2, seroepidemiological study of all contacts of a seropositive person. 3, sanatorial control and medical treatment. 4, health education program about sexual practice. In December of 1985, the Cuban government assigns $2 million for the development of national program for AIDS prevention and control. Serological diagnoses are made 45 with the organ technology and Pasteur technology. In April of 1986, setting off of epidemiological group for AIDS control, investigation for detection of sexual partners is carried out. Experience in sexually transmitted disease program, decision of hospitalization for those being seropositive, and in June 1986, a sanatorium for asymptomatic seropositive and diseased persons is set up. In April of 1986, we began serological tests. It's implemented to every blood donor and to every person being in Africa from 1981 with a 6 months time periodicity after the arrival. Our first disease was a homosexual patient being contaminated in New York. The clinical, the diagnosis, serological, and epidemiological. In June 1986, beginning of medical check-up for workers from tourism, merchant marine, fishing, and airlines, annual periodicity. In September of 1986, serological test is extended to persons being in Africa since 1975. In 1987, beginning of the production of Cuban diagnosis kit, we named David, and in August and October of that year, beginning of serological checkup to pregnant women, first trimester, hospitalized in clinical surgical hospital and in maternities, prisons, and patients suffering from sexual transmitted disease. Therapeutics with ACT to diseases persons. In 1988, development of Cuban Western blot technology, and in the fourth trimester of that year, setting off of ultra microanalytic system, SUMA, and its corresponding kit. In 1989, availability of production and diagnosis of the recombinant kit for ELISA. This has been our strategy in this year. Now, we have to say that as little as we know about the science of epidemiology, we cannot conceive of a sexually transmitted disease program that is not supported by a system of clinical or serologic screening to identify not only those suffering from the diseases, but also asymptomatic carriers and those persons who, although testing negative, could profit from a test that would call their attention the fact that they are at risk and therefore should modify their habits and sexual behavior. We believe that the strategy of following a program of AIDS prevention and control must be based on these ideas. The years of experience in our sexually transmitted disease control and prevention program have been very useful to my country as we confront the problem of AIDS through a social and epidemiological focus. Therefore, once we were able to obtain the diagnostic technology available on the international market, the national health system could, in addition to screening patients in our hospital and clinics, begin to search for asymptomatic seropositive carriers following the same model used to track other sexually transmitted diseases. That's why I consider that the Good AIDS public health program must include among its objectives: 1, serologic study of large groups of the population; 2, epidemiological study for rapid detection of other cases or infected persons; 3, development of a permanent educational policy aimed at keeping seropositive from infecting their sexual contacts. Nevertheless, AIDS itself has called into question this classic approach. So far, ethical, political, social, and economic aspects have prevailed over epidemiological ones, and this has obviously created serious problems concerning the use of diagnostic tests for control and prevention, generating such concepts as forced testing to refer to testing that in other public health and sexually transmitted disease programs would be considered routine. In addition, from the very beginning, the cost of diagnostic technology has been exorbitant, which has made impossible the massive testing of high-risk population, who more often than not are also those with the least economic resources and those least able to pay for medical attention. That's why, in the light of this thinking, whether you agree with it or not, that the Cuban experience, very unique and very linked to the medical traditions and the idiosyncrasies of our people, who very educated in matters of health, enable us to develop a very integrated and cohesive plan of action to prevent HIV infection from becoming more of a public health problem. A massive HIV screening program enables: 1, the determination of the extent of HIV infection in the population; 2, the determination of the principal risk factor and condition; 3, the establishment of a system of notification, registry, and clinical and epidemiological follow-up of those with AIDS and those who have tested HIV positive; 4, the elimination of transmission through blood or blood products; 5, the elimination of perinatal transmission; 6, the prevention of occupational infection; 7, the development of a cohesive program including biological research and epidemiological, social, and therapeutic aspects; 8, the development of a plan of health education and the dissemination of information to the public which will lower the risks of HIV infection, especially through sexual transmission and drug use; 9, the establishment of realistic means of predicting seropositivity, HIV infection, and AIDS cases, and the extent of health researches and medical attention which will be required in the future. Obviously, the carrying out of these objectives require the will and political commitment on the part of governments to develop the strategies that they devise in an ethical and dignified manner and according to legal norms. There then arises the necessity of economic support to finance this approach. The price that have been charged thus far for diagnostic tests, not to mention medication, it is very difficult to carry out the screening policy, calling into question its usefulness. It is therefore necessary to make an international call to lower the cost of available technology regarding diagnostic tests, medicine, and means of prevention, so that the benefits may be shared by all, as has been the case with other sexually transmitted diseases. What has Cuba, a country of more than 10,800,000 inhabitants, achieved since we began our blood screening program in April 1986? 1, we were able to establish in the course of that year that there was a low incidence of the virus in our population and that we had the epidemiological opportunity to avoid the geometric progression of its transmission. 2, we were able to determine the extent of HIV infection in our population by territory, age group, sex, high-risk sexual practice, occupation, etc. 3, we are able to detect seropositivity in as short a period as 3 months after infection, which has permitted us to rapidly locate sexual partners, inform them of the danger to which they have been exposed, and consequently can expose to others, and provide them with very direct health education. 4, we have been able to learn the epidemiological and social characteristics of each seropositive detected, thus helping them to carry out their medical treatment and preparing them to cope psychologically with their illness. 5, we have been able to eliminate the danger of transmission through blood and blood products. From April 1986 to November 2 of this year, we have screened 3,900,000 and more than 40,000 donations and have only detected 51 seropositive for a rate of 0.001%. Only 7 persons have contracted the virus through the blood supply, and all 3 cases were before the initiation of the blood screening program. 6, we have learned that the seropositive heterosexual, whether male or female, have had an average of 5 sexual contacts, and that a homosexual seropositive has had an average of 10. 7, we have been able to learn that the person most at risk for contagion by a seropositive are that person's sexual contacts. For example, while the index of seropositivity in blood donors, hospital inpatients, and hemophiliacs are 0.001%, 0.003%, and 0.031% respectively, the sexual contacts and partners of HIV-positive persons exhibit a seropositivity rate of 6.8%. Of a total of 578,000 tests given in these 6 years to persons with sexually transmitted diseases and their sexual contacts or partners, we have found 68 seropositive, an index of 0.030%. 8, we have been able to diminish to almost 0% the perinatal transmission of HIV. Out of an average of 180,000 births annually, only 3 newborns had the virus in the entire 6-year period. Of 1,086,000 tests carried out on pregnant women, only 16 seropositive were detected during the same period. 9, there has been no case of occupational infection. 10, we have been able to develop an educational program which, while insufficient, has enabled the citizenry to receive information about the problem and the dangers, although we cannot say that it has produced major changes in sexual conduct and the practice of safe sex. I shall conclude by informing this session that the massive screening program enabled us to carry out an average of 2 million tests annually, which from April 1986 to November 2 of 1992 add up to 13,090,000 tests, detecting a total of 859 seropositives for an index of 0.000% in the Cuban population. Since August 1 of this year, all blood have been screening for both HIV-1 and HIV-2. In early 1993, this screening will be extended to include all types of tests which are available. This is our experience. Thanks for attention.
Thank you, Dr. Terry. I'd like to invite now Larry Gostin to comment on Dr. Terry's presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Corey. I'm kind of an amateur studier of developmental psychology, and there's a theory in developmental psychology that many of you may be aware of, is that you can get two highly intelligent, sensitive, decent people viewing the same set of facts, and the two people will see the facts very, very differently and see the conclusions. And I think you will see that I take a different perspective from Dr. Terry, but do so in the context of one that actually happens to admire very much the Cuban healthcare system and what the government has managed to do over decades to improve the health of the public. There is, to be sure, a very good faith attempt to deal with an enormously serious problem in the region. Cuba is in a region of the world that could have had a devastating burden of HIV. We see it in certain Caribbean countries. We're beginning to see it more in Latin America. The fact that there were a number of Cuban citizens in Africa and then coming back to the country certainly presented the government with a real and quite a significant public health problem. And I think it's clear from the statistics that Dr. Terry gave you that the impact of the policy has been, from a public health perspective, beneficial. I can recall early on when debates were ongoing about the Cuban policy, that there were a number of people, AIDS advocates around the globe, that suggested that the policy would be ineffective. I never took that position, and I don't now. I think that the policy from a public health point of view can be extremely important. Moreover, I don't discount the fact that an overwhelming public health benefit can sometimes outweigh certain human rights violations. But what I'm going to try to suggest is that in this case, the human rights burden is so overwhelming that it is simply not justified by the human rights, by the public health benefit that you could receive, and that I'm going to go on to talk about other possible ways to treat the problem in Cuba and other countries like that that are equally aggressive, equally intensive in their resources, maybe not quite as effective, but still very effective without the overwhelming burden on human rights. In a way, this is a subject that two decent men or women could look at and see differently, depending very much on your perspective. And it's not a unique problem. The northern western perspective of human rights sees human rights as very individualistic, looks at individual violations, while other conceptions see it from a societal point of view, a collective point of view. And very often these are irreconcilable. Collective societies may put a greater emphasis on public health and the health of the community or the society than our society here that might place more of an emphasis on human rights. I've been wrestling with these questions in different fora for the World Health Organization, for PAHO, for CIOMS, the Council of International Organization of Medical Sciences. And in those international fora, when we try to kind of reconcile these two very different ways of looking at things, we've basically said that while collective understandings deserve respect, that they can never be a justification for completely ignoring the rights of human beings, of the individual human. And I'm going to try to demonstrate what those deep impact on human rights are in these contexts. I'll focus on two different areas. The first is an assessment of the screening policy in Cuba without getting into the specifics of it, but just looking at it from the point of view of quite considerable population-based screening. And then I'll go on to look at the quarantine aspect of the proposal and finish up by looking at less restrictive alternatives and what could be done. First, let's examine screening. The first question you need to ask yourself is whether this is a program of mandatory or voluntary screening. From one perspective, you might argue that it's voluntary, that everyone would say that we value our society more than ourselves as individuals, and so we agree we believe that this is part of a program that a country can validly impose. Even that being the case, it seems to me that each individual has to have the right to defer, to say, no, I don't agree with that approach. I, as a human being, will not agree to be screened. And effectively, there are three ways that you can look at this. We here in kind of a northern western perspective often look at it from a patient-oriented approach. We say that it is up to the individual to know the consequences of the screening and to say yes or no to the testing. And for many people, if they knew as an individual that the consequence of a positive test result might be that you would miss your home, your family, wouldn't have control over your autonomy and your liberty, we might well say, no, I don't want to do it. There's also a doctor or physician-oriented approach where it's said that the physician will decide. The physician says, I do a whole battery of tests anyway, and it is my decision whether or not this person needs to have an HIV test. Again, this is something that the northern western conception rejects, because we say that it is up to the individual, him or herself, to decide, and that while the physician's role is to provide information and recommendations, the individual, him or herself, has the final decision under a concept of autonomy. And the third is a state-oriented approach. That is, it's not up to the patient or the doctor, but it's just simply for society to decide. All international public health organizations that have done screening proposals, and it's quite fitting that the World Health Organization is having it today, it's convening its follow-up on international screening criteria. I was at the last one, and I was planning to go to this one, but couldn't make it. But I can say that the previous documents, and clearly the ones that are before it now, rely upon the notion of autonomy, that it is for the patient to decide, not the physician, not a state-oriented approach. This is supported by a variety of international human rights documents. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights talks about the right of self-determination. That is the right of each individual or each person to decide for him or herself what should happen. And it seems to me that this is a very important part of human rights. From a professional point of view, we also believe that the doctrine of informed consent is extremely important, because we don't see the doctrine of informed consent as a legalistic kind of conception where an individual will simply say, this is the law and it doesn't matter about anything else. We see informed consent as a part of a process, one where the doctor is able to use it in a process of counseling the individual to inform the individual what the risks are of the intervention, what is likely to be the possible false positive aspects of it, and to allow them to make the decision for themselves. So that informed consent and pre- and post-test counseling are part of a process that has been widely accepted by international public health organizations. From a public health point of view, you also have to look very carefully at a population-based screening effort of this kind, because although the HIV test is by now an extremely reliable instrument, and although we ought to presume that the highest quality control is going on, and I do make that presumption that there is a very high quality of testing and testing analysis in the screening program. Nonetheless, when you subject even the most sensitive and specific testing instrument to a very low prevalence population of the kind that Dr. Terry talked about, the predictive value of the test goes down remarkably. And when you have a low predictive value of the test, you have several features that are not usually thought to be conducive to a good public health program. First is that you have a relatively high false positive rate. That is, for every individual that is said to be positive, a certain percentage of those individuals will be falsely determined to be positive. And it's an inevitable consequence of screening in a very low prevalence population. You also may have false negative results in the sense that individuals are tested and they're said to be negative, but in fact they're positive, so you don't achieve your public health objective that way. And finally, it's highly cost ineffective that you are engaging in quite comprehensive, intensively resourced screening programs to detect only a very few cases. And many people argue that it is much better to put your resources to other kinds of prevention programs like education than a very cost-ineffective, highly expensive program of testing where you're in any case going to only find a very few true positive cases. I'll move on to the quarantine aspect of the case, both in respect of screening, the level of screening, and of quarantine. The Cuban policy is unique in the world. Uniqueness does not suggest necessarily that it's wrong, but it is important to understand that there is no other country in the world that we're aware of that has adopted this level of screening its population and depriving those who test positive of their liberty. We start with the presumption that Cuba did have the opportunity early on to stop the spread of AIDS, and being a small country with relatively confined borders, with an already low prevalence of HIV infection, that it was an opportunity, as Dr. Terry said, to take very firm measures and to achieve remarkable public health results. And that clearly has happened. I'm convinced in hearing the data that Dr. Terry's put forward that there has been this kind of a significant public health benefit. But at what price? Will any price in human rights justify a compelling public health objective? In traditional human rights analysis, if the burden on human rights is so extreme that it would be unconscionable to the international society of humankind, even considerable public benefits will not suffice to outweigh those burdens. Well, what are the burdens in this kind of context? Let me start with saying what some of the burdens are not, because one of the possible criticisms that could have been made is that it violates one of the articles of the Universal Declaration and the American Convention of Human Rights, which prescribes inhuman and degrading treatment. By accounts that I've read of the Cuban situation, the sanitaria, there are humane treatment is provided, and it is not a question of a kind of horrific detention. For example, if one compares it to reports that are underway in the U.S. policy in relation to Haiti, I'm involved in the litigation in that case, and there is increasing evidence that the detention of Haitians awaiting either repatriation back to Haiti or for the very few that might pass two separate AIDS tests and political litmus tests to come to the United States, that their confinement is in degrading and inhuman circumstances. So one has to point out that there is that kind of a very stark difference, and if we do point human rights fingers at one place, we also need to examine our own policies very carefully. We also need to do that in the context of our policies in relation to international travelers and immigrants. We have to remember that's why the Harvard conference was moved to Amsterdam. But there are significant human rights burdens to the Cuban policy. If an individual tests HIV positive, he or she cannot stay in his or her home. so you're deprived of your own home and family life. There is a right under international law to family life, and one is removed from that. I understand that there are greater and greater efforts to allow chaperoned and even sometimes unchaperoned visits home, but nonetheless the basic structure of living one's life with one's spouse and children in privacy is a deeply fundamental human value that needs to be taken very seriously. Questions of liberty also arise. It's obviously the first thing that you consider. And although it is certainly, there are certainly precedent in the history of public health for depriving people of liberty in the name of public health, for the most part, the only ones of those that have had any sustained credibility have been those that have involved actively contagious diseases. For example, the tuberculosis sanitaria, where there was some casual contagion over by coughing. We have to recall that HIV is not infectious in this way, and that the only way that it can realistically be transmitted is through voluntary consensual behaviors on the part of two individuals. The liberty concept is also not one that is limited in the sense that if there were a treatment for HIV to make the person non-infectious and then they could go home, you're talking about an indefinite, probably lifetime deprivation of liberty, which makes it an enormous burden on human rights. There is a concept in human rights that I sometimes call over-inclusiveness. It's a difficult concept to try to explain in a short time. I sometimes spend a class or two trying to explain it, but it is effectively this. Whenever you have a population that is subject to a human rights burden, you have to look at who is being subject. What is the population that is subject to the human rights burden? In this case, it is all people who are HIV positive. But of all of those people who are HIV positive, only a very few of those individuals will actually go on to have unsafe or unprotected sex. The vast majority of them can be trusted to behave carefully, responsibly, and in a way that one would expect of a Cuban citizen. That being the case, what you're doing is you're depriving a person of his or her liberty for a lifetime when that person is not a danger to others, because the person would not engage in that kind of behavior. And over-inclusive policies from a human rights point of view are the worst kinds of policies, because you're depriving a person of their liberty when it is unnecessary, because that individual will not engage in the kinds of behaviors that you're trying to prevent. Because of that, the International Bill of Rights requires individual due process, or what's called natural justice in Europe, so that before you can deprive somebody of their liberty, you have to give them a hearing where it's incumbent upon the state to demonstrate that this individual, him or herself, would pose a significant risk to others. That would be an almost impossible thing to do in Cuba, where you would have a due process hearing for every single person that was deprived of their liberty, and to demonstrate that each one of them would engage in those kinds of behaviors. And so the importance of a hearing has been repeatedly determined to be a definitive requirement of deprivation of liberty by the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations, by the European Convention of Human Rights, the American Convention of Human Rights, and the like. So there is a great price to pay in terms of human rights, but there's also a considerable price to pay in terms of economic cost. Because the program, when you consider the screening, the quarantine, the continuum payment of, for the sanitaria, food, to clothe, to enforce the policy, is an enormous economic cost. This is also an opportunity cost loss, because what occurs is that that is money that you cannot put into education and counseling and voluntary approaches to combating the HIV epidemic in Cuba. And we will probably never know, but if the same kind of will and resources were placed into a very comprehensive program of counseling, education in the country, probably very great strides would have been made from a public health point of view. Not as great as confining all those who are identified as HIV positive, but nonetheless very great. What I've tried to do is look at the same set of facts as Dr. Terry through a different set of eyes. In the end, all international observers need to look at it through their eyes and make a determination whether or not they take human rights seriously, and if so, how they balance that with the public health imperative that clearly does present a challenge in Cuba and many other countries around the world.
Thank you, Larry. I'd like to now invite Dr. Mark Roberts to comment on Dr. Terry's presentation.
Well, I think I want to begin by saying that this is a serious conversation about a very difficult problem. And in some ways, the challenge that Dr. Terry brings to the United States and to all of us is, are we prepared to take this epidemic as seriously as he's prepared to take the epidemic? And are we prepared to think about it with the same degree of political will and with the same degree of awareness of what actually is occurring? When one thinks about the seroprevalence rates in various parts of the world, the degree to which societies are literally at risk of economic and social chaos from the epidemic, I think one has to engage in the exercise of making international judgments with a certain degree of caution. And it's, of course, ironic that, as Larry said, Cuba, which is a society which he admires, should nonetheless produce an outcome that he finds so distasteful. Because this is, of course, an ironic problem of all of the American left, which has for many years admired Cuba and then discovers they do these things that they don't like, and so it puts the American left, in which I think it's fair to number you, Larry, in a certain paradoxical situation, and we might as well recognize this when we start. Now, for me, there are two interesting questions here. Larry has well exposed the fundamental dilemma, which is, to what extent are you prepared to say that the possible effectiveness of the program is worth what it is about it that you don't like? That's the dilemma, and I want to talk about how we could think about this in a somewhat, I think, a more nuanced way. That is, I want to talk about what I see as the premises of Larry's argument, namely, what are international human rights, and where do they come from, and why should we be upset if Cuba doesn't respect them? Rather than assuming human rights, I want to examine human rights because this is really the basis of the disagreement. Before I do that, I want to deal with two technical matters. I think it's really not sensible to do cost-effectiveness analysis of screening in terms of cost per case discovered. Because the purpose of the program is not to discover cases, it's to prevent cases. So you really should do it as cost per case prevented. And so the only way to really evaluate the screening program is to think about what the number of cases would have been if we hadn't had the screening program. The most successful screening programs would have infinite costs per case because there'd be no cases. That doesn't mean that they're not cost effective. Excellent police departments may have very high costs per arrest because there's no crime. That doesn't mean they're ineffective police departments. So I think you've got the numerator wrong. Also, on the predictive value of screening in low prevalence populations, there's to do a bit of statistics for a moment. Obviously, no test is perfect. If the false positive rate is 1 in 10,000, and the true positive rate is 1 in 10,000, then half the apparent positives will be false and half will be true. But the question is, do you think that the cost of false positives depends on the number of false positives or the ratio of false positives? Notice the number of false positives does not depend on the number of true positives. The number of false positives depends on how many people you test and the false positive rate, say 1 per 10,000. And I've never been persuaded that finding 1 false positive per 10,000 is okay if you discover 10 true positives, and it's not okay if you discover 1 true positive. Because the cost of false positives depends not on the proportion of false positives to me, but the number of specific individuals who are involved. So the fact that the proportion of true positives goes down in low prevalence populations also seems to me not a definitive objection to screening. What's really at stake is the false positivity rate, and as Larry's mentioned, particularly for cascaded ELISA and Western blot tests, the false positive rate in AIDS screening is now extremely low. Leaving those technical matters aside, let's turn to the question about human rights. And on what basis can those of us in the United States plausibly stand in judgment of Dr. Terry? It seems to me that there are 3 possible ways we could justify this argument. Historically, the United States, Larry characterized it as Northern Western. I would characterize it as Northern European, largely Christian, maybe Judeo-Christian tradition that's embodied in things like we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Maybe familiar language to some of you. That really is the origin of human rights tradition in the West. It goes back to the book of Genesis. It involves notions of divinity, soul, and spark. It's, I think, coming under increasing attack as people talk about things like the rights of plants and animals, the rights of nature. It's not just collective societies that have objections to human rights framework. Many Eastern points of view would suggest that the sharp distinction between man and animal is not appropriate, and the notion of dominion over the earth in Genesis is not appropriate, and that's actually all part of the intellectual origin of the human rights tradition. Somehow human beings are special and different from other species and are entitled to these special rights. So that's the historic argument. It's in philosophical terms, it's a moral realist argument. The rights are out there, they exist, as Ronald Dworkin would say, whether we acknowledge them or not. They're real, and they're somehow immanent in the world. I find that argument really quite uncompelling. It seems to me to be at best species-centric, at worst geocentric. I look forward with enthusiasm to the discovery of extraterrestrial life, and we try to figure out whether Alpha Centaurians have rights and what God did to the immortal soul of the people from the planets around the star Sirius. I don't find this, as I said, a compelling argument. So what's the alternative justification if we do away with this sort of neo-supernatural or naturalism? The alternative justification is sort of a social contract or communitarian argument, that the human rights exist not outside of and independent of us, but they exist because we have established them. And Larry suggested at some points that that's in fact his view. He talked about the International Society of Humankind and made a reference to a variety of various documents. Now, the question then becomes, what is the appropriate scope, what is the appropriate community for deciding on where rights come from? And if some people don't accept the judgment of others, on what grounds can we compel them to accept that judgment and say that they're wrong? Or to put it another way, on what grounds can we conclude that there is a compelling international community? And here I want to raise what is to me a serious difficulty. Individuals who live in a society where their own views are morally successful tend to believe that the natural order of the world confirms the truth of their own prejudices. Think what it was like to be a Spanish conquistador ruling over large slices of Mexico in the 16th century. You certainly were convinced that the sovereign of Spain and the Catholic Church represented the true order of the world, and your exploitation of the native populations was appropriate because, by golly, you wouldn't have succeeded if you weren't right. I suppose Genghis Khan's generals believed a similar thing when they rode to the gates of Budapest. Those of us in the European-American imperial West live in a world in which our own particular ideologies tend to be quite successful and dominant. And that gives us a certain degree of self-confidence, which I believe is in many ways not warranted. Interesting question about whether if we took a vote among all people on the planet, the international view of human rights that Larry represents would be accepted. I mean, if we weighed in all the Chinese, the Indonesians, the Indians, it's not obvious to me that the International Convention on Human Rights would pass by genuine majority rule in a worldwide plebiscite, or that it ever has, or that it ever did. To what extent is the existence of this document, I put this to you seriously, merely the reflection of the successful intellectual imperialism of the northern and western individuals who dominated the construction of the United Nations and the education of the leaders, even from the developing world, who were invited into its participation at the time. So I think we have to take very seriously the question about how self-confident we should be in our own judgments of people like Dr. Terry. Now, I personally believe that Cuba has gone down the wrong path. I personally share Larry's concerns about the loss of individual freedom. And I personally would believe that the world would be a better place if Dr. Terry and his colleagues had chosen a different way of proceeding. But I would prefer to pose my objections not from the perspective of someone who believes that there are transnational standards that are compelling on Dr. Terry, but rather in a way that recognizes the possibility that I can learn from him as well as he can learn from me. I would rather enter into a conversation in which it's possible that my own views are subject to amendment as well as for judgment on his behavior. And I would therefore pose to you to think about the following questions. To what extent is it appropriate for a society faced with serious health problems to be willing to override the views and values of its citizens? Is our view of the Cuban AIDS policy dependent upon the extent to which we believe Cuba is a genuine political democracy or not? Would it be more acceptable or less acceptable if we thought that there was a genuine political freedom and free elections there? Would we be more or less happy with the policy if we thought it had been preceded by widespread public discussion, as opposed to imposed by a relatively small group of a committee of experts? And would we think differently of the policy if we thought that it was conceivably subject to a modification and amendment through democratic political processes? Much of my concern with Dr. Terry's presentation is that he presents himself, as many public health people do, as the modern equivalent of Plato's philosopher kings who really know what's good for everybody. Indeed, this is my problem with Marxism in general, because Leninism portrays the dictatorship of the vanguard of the proletariat as an appropriate, non-democratic unit for making decisions about public policy. And in that sense, Cuba's AIDS policy is not inconsistent with a Leninist perspective in general. It's just one more manifestation of it. But I do this not because I think they're worldwide human rights that he's violating, but rather because I think that he is losing an opportunity to have created a genuinely humane and participatory and egalitarian society in Cuba, a failure in which I hold U.S. policy a co-conspirator at best. And so it's with a great deal of sympathy that with his problem, that I reach a similar conclusion to Larry, but I do so, I think, from the point of view of a very different analysis. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'd like to give Dr. Terry an opportunity, before opening the floor for discussion, to comment on the comments of Dr. Gostins and Roberts.
Well, it is a pity that my English is not so good, and I cannot explain as I wanted the answers about these questions. But I try to specify, to emphasize some aspects that I think that they are important. For example, in Cuba, our people have the right, the human right to live. Our people have the human right to health. Our people have the human right to have a home. We don't have homeless people. In our country, the people have the human right to have a job. And we have been working to get these human rights for our people during the 33 years after the triumph of our revolution. We are not thinking that we can exchange our national AIDS program in another country. We think that every country has to find this strategy about this idiosyncrasy, about his tradition, and I come to tell you that our people is agree with our program in Cuba, and we have a cultured people in our country. We don't have analphabet people in our country. It is another human right that we got with our revolution, the human right to study, and we have a cultural and educational people. And these people is working with the officials and all the public health system to avoid the spread of the AIDS virus in our country. And why is the reason that we could develop this program? May you develop this program in the United States? It is not. It is not possible. It is not possible because you have your tradition, you have your idiosyncrasy, and you lose, and you don't have the opportunity that we have in Cuba. It's not possible to create a sanatorium for thousands of seropositive persons as you have here in the United States, or for millions of seropositive persons as you have here in the United States. But you have to think that when we began our program, we have only few seropositive persons who have the AIDS virus. And we thought at that moment what to do. We thought at the moment we are going to lose this opportunity. No, we took a severe decision. We know, but we have all our efforts for this, the possibility of our patients in the sanatoriums, all the possibilities to maintain the expectancy of life and to receive the best treatment about AIDS. In our country, we pay the whole salary to every people who carries the virus. In our country, these people is not in absolute quarantine. A group of them are working inside and outside the sanatorium at this moment, because we are working to make better our sanatorium system. In the week, every week, these people visited their parents every weekend. This is the reason, because all the provinces have a sanatorium, because this permits the possibility of relation between the family. When a person has a problem in his family, he go out to their home, and if it is necessary to stay some time, some period in their home, there is no problem to stay in their homes. We are increasing all this effort to perfection our sanatorium system, and but we think that furthermore of human rights, every people and everybody has the human right and the duty, have a duty with him, with her family, with her parents, and with the community. And we cannot accept, for example, the situation that 2 or 3 months ago passed in England, for example, that a man had 8 women, and he was a seropositive carrier. He knows that he was a seropositive carrier, and he had 8 women, but he didn't say to any women, I am a seropositive carrier, and he spread the virus in some of these women. We cannot accept this human right if it is the universal human right. It is our opinion. About the situation of testing, in Cuba it is a routine situation, not from the revolution. Before the revolution, 30 years before the revolution, in Cuba we test every people who are going to work against several diseases, and of course it is a routine form way of work in our country, in our public health system country. Maybe it is not good in another countries, but you can question or ask some people in Cuba if they are disagree with the testing program. And you have I think that it is very important that we created the possibilities to maintain the relation about this and another program in public health in both countries, because I think that both are going to learn about many things. And here in the United States, I have not the possibility to speak as I wanted, because I don't have all the possibility of the English language, and I think that I hear it is some disadvantage, no? Disadvantage. But I invite you, Dr. Larry Goldstein, and you to visit our country and to make a new encounter, because I think that it is important to continue speaking, and you have the I wanted that you and all the people here have the make sure that we are fighting every moment, every minute, every day, every week against the threat for our country. As you know, I am a deputy minister, and the 90% of my time during the last 6 years is about the AIDS problem, and I have the necessity to fight against another disease, against about occupational health, nutrition, hygiene, environmental hygiene, all the fight against preventable diseases, and I have decided to give all my time to this real problem. We have not. I told you, maybe you don't agree with our point of view, but I think that we have to make a balance of our results, and up to now, nobody has gave off the solution for this problem. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to open the floor for discussion, but before, let me just briefly paint the scenario of the Caribbean, which is one of the most important focus of HIV infection in the world. We have the most important island, Cuba, with almost 11 million inhabitants, and with about 1,000 reported cases, with all the issues of the contamination of the soldiers in Angola and other African countries. They have reported around 1,000 cases. In Cuba, of the 11 million inhabitants, there's about 1 million of them living in the United States. Next door, we have Hispaniola. The western part of it is Haiti, with 5 million inhabitants, 1 million people of them living outside of Haiti, and with rates of infection that cannot be counted. Maybe 30% of the population in some areas, 25, 40% are HIV infected with absolutely no control. The eastern part of the island, Dominican Republic, with 6 million inhabitants, and only nearby here in Jackson Heights, it's called the northern part of New York City, Washington Heights, 1 million Dominicans and about 500,000 mainly prostitutes all over the world, of which the rates of infection also are rampant and without any control. Next door, Puerto Rico, with 3.4 million inhabitants, of which also 2.5 million in the United States, and for 3.4 million inhabitants, 8,000 cases, mainly related with drug addiction, with good programs in which there is respect for human rights. That's the scenario of the Caribbean in which we are discussing the policies in one of these islands with its pros and its cons, and I now open the floor for debate.
Without getting into too sectarian a discussion, I liked what you said at the end, Mr. Roberts, the rhetorical question you asked, But I would say that the left is, I think, such as it is far from monolithic and doesn't have a unitary view of either Cuba or human rights. And I don't know if it's accurate to equate Marx and Marxism, or if you can get an agreement on what it is, with what I think you did accurately describe as Leninist vanguardism. I wanted to just mention one of the things that Mr. Gostin said, I think, just struck me, with all due respect, as nonsense, and I think it was touched on by Dr. Terry, when you said that all transmission is between consenting adults. Just in today's New York Times, there's this little article that says, man charged with exposing at least 5 children to AIDS. Just a couple of sentences, he was indicted on charges of attempted murder for allegedly exposing at least 5 children. The indictment said Mr. Brown, who's 30 years old, sexually abused 9 children, having unprotected sex with 5 of them while knowing he had tested positive for HIV. The authorities said some of the 9 children were enrolled at a daycare center which was not identified. Mr. Brown, who was a lay minister at a church not connected to the center, used his position to gain trust at the center, the authorities said. So I think just as a factual matter, I mean, I'm not running out, let's get alarmist based on one particular allegation. But as a factual matter, I think it's something that we have to be accurate and honest about. And I wonder if anybody, you or any of the other panelists would comment on that. And is it true that in the U.S. military, people have a different set of quote-unquote human rights as far as testing is concerned?